Do you know what's stopping you from doing that one thing you've always wanted to do? You don't, because it doesn't exist. This is Josh Bauer, and no, it really doesn't exist. I'm pretty young, and I am young enough to where there are a lot of historical events, even in American history and relatively recent American history, although I suppose you would not call this recent, that I do not remember because I was not alive or I was so young that I just was not able to comprehend what was happening at the time. So an example of this would be Watergate. Now, Watergate was actually a DNC, which is that stands for Democratic National Convention Center. Basically, it was a DNC headquarters. And what happened here was basically the Democratic Party in America would plan the political campaign for whoever the Democratic nominee was for that upcoming election. Now, the Watergate scandal involved President Nixon and basically was a case in which President Nixon directed people inside of his campaign to plant bugs inside of this DNC headquarters. And they did so by breaking into it, which was obviously illegal, and then spying on people, wiretapping them, all that was also illegal. So it was highly illegal, and President Nixon obviously was president at the time, and he was trying to get reelected. So not only was all this illegal, but he was doing it from a place of extreme power. It was an astonishing abuse of power, really, is what it was. And I find this fascinating because, a lot of people are so quick to judge President Nixon and to say, what he did was horrible. And certainly it was not an ideal situation for him to find himself in, to have to explain to the people who elected him that he's taking his power and top-down abusing it to prevent anybody else from challenging him. That's certainly not how the democratic process is supposed to unfold. Now, with that said, you have to put yourself in his shoes. Now, am I saying that this was justified or that I think that this is anything near good? Absolutely not. But what I'm saying is that when I first hear about something like Watergate, I would say that's not good, right? That's immoral. And yet I'm recording this podcast because even though I've heard about Watergate many times, I never actually knew what it was until a recent podcast that I started listening to. Let me put it this way. I've been listening to this podcast forever. It's called American Scandal. It's by Wondery. But a recent series within that podcast on Watergate. And I clicked on it and started listening to it because, again, I've heard this term Watergate so many times, and I was interested in actually knowing what it was. I didn't know until I started listening to this podcast that it was even related to President Nixon. And again, this kind of shows how young I am and I guess how little understanding of presidential history I have, because this was a very major political event. I believe, I could be wrong about this, but President Nixon, was he in prison? I believe the president after him pardoned him, which makes me assume there must have been something for him to be pardoned from. I assume he might have been in prison for a short amount of time. Whatever the case, I know he was definitely prosecuted. He had to have been charged and convicted if he was pardoned. But anyway, he definitely resigned. I know it was a major event. And the title of this episode is Let He Who Has Not Sinned Cast the First Stone, right? And I just think it's notable to point out, and measuring Nixon's actions by my actions is not the best criteria by which to determine whether or not his actions were moral or not. I'm not saying that if it's something I did or would have done, then it's good, and therefore you should hold him to lesser of a standard. I'm not saying that, but I just think it's interesting because as soon as I listened to this podcast and I actually realized what Watergate was, that it was Nixon's re-election campaign attempting to gather more information in order to increase his chances of getting reelected, and the means by which they gathered that information from their opponent was sketchy at best and more likely highly illegal. When I found that out, the first thing that came to my head was, this was literally what I did in high school. Okay, so I ended up getting expelled before I was able to actually run for president, which is kind of funny in and of itself. But I was going to be running for president of the student council. I would have been in 11th grade. I was already the treasurer for 2 consecutive terms in the student council. I ran unopposed both times, and I was going to run for president during the next student council election, okay? But this time, unlike my 2 previous terms, I would not be running unopposed. I would have been running against one of the most popular students in that school. It was a smaller private school. And that very popular student also happened to be my best friend and kind of my business partner in one of the little endeavors we had going at the time. So him and I worked together at a lot of things, and we were good friends, and this would have been, I think, a good-natured competition, but it would have definitely been a fierce and competitive election, for sure, because him and I definitely both had a lot of ego, and we definitely had competed in many other forms up until that point as well. But again, we were very, very good friends. But that said, it would not have been easy for me to win. I knew I would have had to put up a fight. I made all sorts of flyers, and I even made a poem. It was actually a good poem. In fact, I'm gonna read the poem. Okay, before I read that poem, I'm just going to say that I was shocked when I finally found out what the Watergate scandal was, because it was exactly like a scheme that I had set up in my student council election campaign, but prior to it, because I hadn't even started campaigning yet officially, I was just preparing for it. I had literally established something called the SCIC-SICA, SCIC-SICA. To the best of my memory, this stood for Student Council Intelligence Committee of Secret Information and Counteractions. Now, I feel like the name speaks for itself. Basically, now I had, this goes back years. I would have been 16, now I'm 22, so this would have been 6 years ago approximately. I was in 11th grade of high school, and I don't remember all the plans that I had necessarily for this little organization called SCIC-SICA, which would have been like a branch of my campaign, but the idea would have been primarily, again, but as evidenced by the name, secret information and counteractions. The idea would have been to embed spies in my opponent's, in his campaign, so for me to figure out what types of things he was going to try to run on, and either for me to steal them as quickly as possible, or for me to have an edge ahead of time, so I have more time to prepare on how to counterdict them. Or if we're talking about me getting a draft of what his student council speech was going to be, let's say I intentionally let him speak first, but I already know what he's going to say, and so because I've had weeks of preparation, I could speak after him in my presidential speech or whatever to the entire school, and I could fluently debunk everything he said because I've had weeks of preparation, and leave myself for the last word. Whatever advantages I got from that organization, I figured would have been instrumental in me winning that campaign. Now, that's not to say it would not have been possible for me to win without obtaining secret information from his campaign, but I think there certainly would have been an edge that I could have gotten from doing that. And I was 16 when I thought of this idea. I didn't know at the time what the Watergate scandal was. It definitely was not my inspiration. I was not inspired by anything else when I thought this plan up. I was just like, okay, intelligence is extremely valuable. Knowledge is extremely valuable. And I knew this as a 16-year-old. Again, I I had certain political leanings, but I was not very politically knowledgeable in terms of how to run a very good campaign. I didn't really do much research at this time. Everything I did was just based on instinct and just based on what felt right and what I felt would have gotten me elected by the students. I really hadn't studied any national or state politics or anything like that, or looked into what got people elected. I just knew that, people like food. People like food a lot. People like money, and people like activities, and people like wearing pajamas to school, and just dumb stuff like this that you can run on that people will elect you if you promise them. And I also knew that if you either steal or rebuke or refute ideas or promises by your opponent, and if you can get that information ahead of time, it gives you a huge advantage. And so before this campaign even started, I created what I called the SCIC-SICA. Now, I never actually got to recruit anybody into this, and this is one of the reasons that I really wish I had stayed at that school until graduation. Even if I had lost that campaign, that would have been sad, but I would have still really, really enjoyed the fight leading up to it, and I would have enjoyed trying to embed spies in my opponent's campaign. That would have been so fun. And by the way, I don't think that would have broken any rule. I mean, it's social engineering, right? It's not like you're hacking them necessarily. It's just social engineering. Each candidate has their own campaign. They each have their own treasurer and secretary and everybody that runs on the same ticket. And so that in and of itself is people that support you and are going to try to help you get elected. And and out of those people, they each have assistants too. So if I could basically, I don't know if I would have paid the assistant, like the assistant treasurer on the other ticket, if I would have paid them to spy on their own side, or I don't know how I would have convinced them to do it. I don't remember what my plan was there, but whatever my plan was, the idea was to find somebody in his campaign and turn them into a spy so that I could get information beforehand. All this is to say, and maybe the person listening to this says, "Oh wow, Josh, you are such an immoral person." But you know what? Whoever is casting that stone at me, shall we say, probably, I'm guessing, has never ran for president. And maybe I could be wrong about that. Maybe you have run for president for something, but you did it in a very moral way. Or maybe you just were not smart enough to think about how you could get an edge. I don't know which of the two it is, or maybe it's both. And I mean that politely, but I do like to think that I'm a pretty... I don't think I'm a very unethical person. I feel like, to some degree, if you can get somebody, someone inside your opponent's campaign to spy on them, that's not your fault. That's their fault for not properly vetting the people in their own campaign and making sure that they're all loyal, That's kind of where I stand on that. Now, again, I think it's very interesting that had I not gone through this whole presidential process in high school, where I was planning out a presidential campaign and instinctively, of my own making and of my own creativity, came up with this way to spy on my opponent and gain as much intelligence that I wasn't supposed to have as possible. If I had not gone through that experience, then when I first learned about Watergate, I would have been like, oh wow, that was horrible. That was illegal. That was awful. I can't believe he did that. He should have been impeached. He should have been in prison, blah, 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 blah. But because I actually had that experience myself, as soon as I actually heard and found out through this podcast about what Watergate was, I was like, wow, this literally describes me to the absolute T. Like, this was me, but the President of the United States. Like, how have I not heard about this before? This is hilarious. That everything that I was trying to do as the student council presidential candidate at 16 in 11th grade was actually done by the President of the United States, and he got caught and had to resign. And I thought that was crazy. But it really just represents, to me, it represents how, unless you have yourself been in a situation where you have to make a difficult decision, and you have made the quote-unquote more moral decision and have resisted the temptation of making a more morally questionable decision in favor of giving yourself an advantage, unless you have done that, unless you've been in the situation yourself and made the quote-unquote better decision, I really don't think you have any right to throw stones from a distance, you know? And that doesn't mean that certain things are probably wrong. Like, regardless of whether or not you've ran for student council treasurer yourself, that doesn't mean it's not still wrong for the President of the United States to try to keep himself in power through unconstitutional means. That's not really the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is just, it can be that your opinion of the morality or the reasonability of somebody's decision, somebody else's decision, can change dramatically simply because you yourself have been subjected to a similar decision. I think that sometimes it's hard to put yourself in somebody's shoes, especially if we're talking about a crime that's maybe a little bit more egregious than this, maybe a violent crime. It's very hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes in a lot of those cases. But I think it's beneficial for you to do. One reason I think it's beneficial for you to do it is you make less enemies, in my opinion. I mean, sometimes you choose your enemies, sometimes your enemies choose you, right? And what I mean by that is whether or not somebody else turns into your enemy, usually, I mean, it could be a mutual decision, but I think in a lot of cases, there will be one of those two people that are the first to regard the other as an enemy. If it's that person that makes that decision first, then that's a little bit less out of your control. But if somebody else infringes on you is one way I like to think about it. You have the duty of determining, and of course ego plays a lot into this, you have the duty of determining whether or not that infringement was justified and whether or not you are able to allow yourself to let it go due to it being justified. So for example, let's say that I had pursued this method, and let's say that I had actually, stayed at this school and gathered this information about my opponents and also my friends, right, campaign, and I had used that against him. Let's say I had used that information. Let's say I had a copy of his speech because one of the assistants got a copy and turned on him and gave it to me, right? And I had a copy of his speech before he spoke, and that I was able to put some very clever remarks into my speech afterwards that I gave that debunked a bunch of his stuff or whatever. And of course, him hearing that, he would have been like, okay, one of two things is true. Either Josh wrote a speech and went completely off script because of what I said, and he was spontaneously brilliant in debunking a bunch of my stuff on the spot. Or number two, which would have been more likely by the fact that I was probably staring at my paper the whole time, somehow he knew exactly what I was going to say and typed up a speech in preparation for what I was going to say. How did he get that information? He definitely cheated. And so to the extent that, my opponent would have considered me to have cheated, which he would have been, I suppose, correct in some fashion, that could definitely be viewed as unethical, and he could have viewed that as an infringement, definitely on the legitimacy of that election, but also on our friendship in general, right? And so he would have to ask himself, okay, was what he did justified, right? And that's a little bit harder. So, for example, for my opponent, he was probably running for a couple reasons, some of which were the same as my reasons, which, it's fun to run and you want to be in power and everything and you want to be popular and all that stuff. Another reason that he was probably running is that he wanted it on his resume because he wanted to get into a little bit more of a prestigious college. Now, that's a reason that I can actually understand. And so if he had used some of those questionable tactics against me, I feel like it's kind of a fair game. I don't think I would have really held that against him. Maybe he had, for all I know, he was playing, this was a smart guy, I'll tell you right now. For all I know, he was planning the exact same thing as soon as he knew I was running against him. And I would have considered it fair game. If he had done that against me better than I had done it against him, I really don't think I would have held that against him as a friend. And the reason I don't think I would have held it against him, number one, is because I was doing the same thing to him. So you can't blame somebody else for doing something to you that you were doing to him. But number two, even if I weren't, and even if I had gotten blindsided by that, I think if I had really analyzed whether or not what he did was justified, and therefore whether or not I considered it to be an infringement, and furthermore something that jeopardized our ability to remain friends, when I would have analyzed that, I would have had to think, even if I hadn't done it, is this something that I could see myself feeling the need to do in his situation? And if I could reasonably answer that with a yes, then I think I would be hard-pressed to hold a grudge against him for that, right? And as I'm listening to this Watergate episode, Wondery is an amazing podcast producer, and they do certain things really well. One of the things they do very, very well is tell the story from the point of view of whoever the story is about, whether that is the villain or the hero, so to speak. And it turns out that when you listen to, so for example, they were doing some episodes on the drug cartels in Mexico. And, you think of drug cartel and you think, okay, that's bad. Everybody involved is bad. Bad, 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 bad. And yeah, generally drugs definitely ruin a lot of lives and they cause a lot of violent crime and everything. But the way they tell the story, they tell it sometimes from the point of view of certain people within these drug cartels, and it kind of helps you relate to the decisions that they're making and being like, okay, he made that decision under these circumstances. Okay, I can relate with that decision. Maybe if I were in his place, I would have made the same decision, And you say, okay, he just made that decision too. He was under pressure from these people. He had to do this by this certain time, or this would happen, and so he did this so that this didn't happen. Like, okay, that seems reasonable to me. I could see myself making that decision as well. And Wondery kind of shines the same spotlight on these campaign officials in Nixon's administration, and they say, okay, this guy is under pressure to reelect the president, and so, he... And maybe not all that pressure was from the president himself. Maybe some of it was just because, it's good to be successful. Not because he was being coerced or anything, but just because, they wanted to win as a team. And so he gives this other guy a budget, okay, and says, this is what you can do with the budget. And the guy says, okay, well, we need some more information. What's the best way to get this information? And most of it's legitimate. And there is a point at which they crossed the line with illegality and bugging somebody's phone. I believe wiretapping is a crime in most situations, unless it's being used to, for certain legal federal purposes, of which that certainly was not. And also breaking into the Watergate facility was also definitely a crime. So I'm not saying it's a gray area. There is definitely a line that was crossed, but it really, the way in which they tell it does allow you to think about it from the perspective of the person who made the quote-unquote wrong decision, and it allows you to realize how what seems like it should be a black and white decision is a little bit more gray when it's you in the situation. So again, I'm not saying that anything that they did was not wrong or, was justifiable. But I guess what I'm saying is that y'all probably would have done the same damn thing that Nixon, that he did, or that he pressured his administrative officials to do, that he, or that his campaign staff actually tried to do, and obviously got caught and failed. And how do I know that? Because I literally would have, I had a plan to do the same thing. I mean, I wouldn't have broken the law, but I also wouldn't have had to. Now, just because I was planning a way to do it, does that mean you would have done it too? Like I said before, there are two situations in which that's not the case. Number one is you are more ethically sound than I am, and number two is you're just not as smart as I am, and maybe both, like I said. But other than that, I feel like a lot of people that put two and two together, who realize that information is important to a campaign, not just information in general, but specifically information about what your opponent is doing, what angles they're taking. That is helpful for you to know. And if you can get, they are not going to willingly divulge that information to you. You have to go out and get it. And the more effective ways of getting that information sometimes is a little bit more ethically in a gray area. So all this, again, is to say that I really think it's beneficial, both for me. I probably have the habit, too, of hearing something and being like, oh, that's terrible, I can't believe he did that, without leaving some consideration open as to why did he do it? What would I have done in that situation? I think it's good for you to acknowledge and take into account the factors which pressured a certain decision by somebody else, and not just the fact that, oh, he made a bad decision. I think you should also consider, why did he do that? And consider what you would have done in the same situation before you throw stones from a glass building, is a good way of putting it. I think that doing this more often will help you to realize that maybe not everybody is as horrible as you thought. And on another note, like I was saying before, it helps you to maybe get along a little bit better with some of the people in your life. If you can, instead of immediately assuming that they're out to get you and they're a horrible person, maybe just think about, what would you do if you were in their situation? Also, maybe you don't know all the facts that they are dealing with when they make the decision that they make, right? I think there are some situations in which you might think somebody screwed you over, whereas in reality, they were not being offensive and trying to screw you over. They were just being defensive, and unfortunately, you were collateral damage, and that sucks. But they have to keep themselves in mind first. Everybody, I think, is to some extent selfish by nature, and they have to, and I think most people are not out to fuck over everybody else. But at the same time, they have to protect themselves, and if that results in a less of an ideal outcome for you, then as far as they're concerned, that's unfortunate, but it's a necessary result. And if you can acknowledge that sometimes and realize it, then I think it helps you to maybe reconcile with that person and not necessarily have to end the relationship. Now, there are certain instances where there are infringements that are so egregious you can't look past it, and of course that's the case. But I think that before you automatically say, okay, this person I'm working with just is a terrible person that I cannot associate with again, you have to think, why did he do it? And is it something that I would have done or believe I could have reasonably done if I were in his situation? And if the answer to that is yes, then perhaps it's somebody that you don't have to completely cut out of your life and disassociate with. Maybe you can just call them up and say, hey, listen, I don't like what you did. Obviously, it was not in my best interest. I don't like how this turned out, but I think I know why you did it, and I respect why you did it. I'm wondering, where we can go from here and how we can move forward in a productive way. Now, I'm not saying this is possible with everyone. There are some absolute terrible people out there. I'm not denying that. There are some people that have no regard for ethics at all. Those are not the people I'm talking about. I guess the people that I'm talking about are the people that have a mountain in front of them and are tasked with getting rid of the mountain. And to do so, it ends up being the case that they have to blow some shit up, right? It's gonna take a lot of dynamite to get rid of that mountain, and in a process, some people are probably gonna get hurt. But how else are you gonna get rid of that mountain? So when there is somebody that is in charge of getting rid of a mountain and they take some steps to do that might cause collateral damage, I'm just saying sometimes maybe you should give them the benefit of the doubt. That's what I've learned. Put yourself in people's shoes, and I think it'll help you to think a little bit differently about the world. All right, that's all I got, and I hope this was helpful. As promised, I'm now going to jump in and read the poem that I wrote from scratch for my presidential-elect campaign. Now, keep in mind, this was like 6 years ago. This was far before ChatGPT, and yeah, I was pretty good at writing poems around this time, and I guess I won't have to say that. You'll probably just pick that up. Let's keep the products coming, keep the income flowing, Keep the eyes, the ears, the hearts, the souls of people glowing. Revive our only goal. Renew our only hope. Create the drive, the will, the pride, the spark that keeps us going. For in this time of doubt and in this time of worry, remove the shades, the fog, the blinds that keep the light from showing. So in this next election, don't choose the wrong selection. Elect the former treasurer to keep this great school growing. Vote for Josh Bauer as president.